challenges are obvious. High cost of food and fuel hurt the pocketbook of the average citizen. It reduces money available for other spending. It certainly leads to tightening monetary conditions because the central bank is forced to raise interest rate, which can be challenging for both individuals and corporates. So I think we all know why inflation is undesirable, and we all know the channels through which high inflation hurts an economy. But what about the opportunities? Let's start with the commodity sector. If fossil fuel prices, coal, gas, oil, are high, it actually encourages energy transition. The relative price adjustment, as we call it in economics, that is, you need the things that you want to move away from become expensive, and only then there are financial incentives to move away to the alternative, is there. I think that is what's going to happen with this spurt of inflation. High energy cost has made many countries around the world energy insecure. The way to solve this insecurity is not by mining for more fossil fuel, but by coming up with green, alternative, renewable sources of energy, so wind and solar and hydrogen and so on. So I think that this high inflation experience of 2021, 2022 would motivate further green transition as opposed to discouraging it. That's one. Second is the question of equity. We know that inflation hurts the poor much more so than the rich. The rich are not worried about a 5, 10, 20% increase in fuel or food prices. But a person who's a day-to-day worker, is in the lower middle class of the society, for them, a 10, 20% increase in food and fuel prices is extremely destabilizing and damaging to their livelihoods. And hence, when inflation is high, instead of trying to control that price for everybody in the economy, perhaps the idea should be to allow prices to adjust, but at the same time, target those who are most vulnerable and give them social assistance. And this is not going to be that hard because through the COVID pandemic, in Indonesia and many other countries in the world have come up with mechanisms to reach out to the most vulnerable quickly using the bank accounts, using the transfer system. And I think that's what's needed even in times like this.
Okay, and that's actually what's happening here in Indonesia. So talking about what happens in Indonesia, so how about the outlook for Indonesia's economic growth in the midst of soaring inflation? But even though we know that by year to date, it's actually on 3.5% for the inflation in Indonesia.
So I think that domestic production of energy and food and a wide variety of products that Indonesians consume on a day-to-day basis remain substantial. So you don't have to worry about importing inflation on fuel and food like many other countries in Asia are worried about right now. So Indonesia is blessed with a very large domestic production base. And as a result, the risk of very high inflation because of what's happening in the rest of the world, I think is modest, which is precisely why Bank Indonesia is being very cautious in normalizing policy. They're not trying to match what the Fed is doing. Now, the overall growth outlook is somewhat balanced in our view. So on the negative side is the possibility that manufactured goods exports, non-commodity exports would suffer as global demand slow and interest rates go up. But on the positive side, there is a lot of income that is taking place in the commodity sector through the exports channel. As I mentioned earlier, there is substantial upside for the tourism sector, which basically saw nothing by way of earnings or activity in 2021. So starting from that zero base, only upside remains for the tourism sector. So tourism, commodity exports are two positives that should keep growth well above 4%. And the final point, we have already talked about this, is that living with COVID, that we will keep schools and factories and ports open, even if a new variant emerges, because we have the wherewithal, the know-how to deal with it through vaccination, through antiviral treatments, through medical procedures. And hence, we are moving past COVID, and that's another plus for the.
Okay, so we already have the state revenue and expenditure budget draft for 2023. So how DBS Bank's point of view on this one? Because we said the economic growth will be at 5.3 until 5.9%, and the inflation is around 3 plus minus 1%, just like this year. So what do you think about that one?
So with respect to those assumptions, we probably have slightly lower growth expectation, a slightly higher inflation expectation, maybe a somewhat weaker rupiah, but not that different. But on the budget, it's a very interesting situation now. So the budget assumed subsidies would go down in 2022. I think we can all say that is not going to happen. And hence there's a gap between the reality in the market where prices are going up for energy products, and especially the ones that are being subsidized, and the assumptions that were put in the budget a few months ago, understandably, are not in line with reality. But this tension in the budget is offset by the fact that high commodity prices and exports of those commodities are creating a very large revenue upside for the government of Indonesia. So we're seeing non-tax revenues, royalties and fees and so on from commodity exporters goes up substantially, even though we're getting a bit worried about other sources of revenues weaken. So net, the budget is in good shape. On the subsidy, probably the assumptions are not quite right, but on the non-tax revenue, also the assumptions were not quite right. The difference is the subsidy assumption being wrong would increase the deficit, but the non-tax revenue assumption being wrong would increase the revenue side and reduce the deficit.